Okay, end of introduction. Here's the scenario, and I hope it has special resonance for this community. All animal species tend to evolve into an ecological niche and stabilize themselves there. Ants and termites have been at equilibrium for hundreds of millions of years. Our remote ancestors also were on a direct course toward that kind of dynamic equilibrium. We were evolving toward being fruit-eating, canopy-living, insectivorous primates with an advanced repertoire of pack signals, and this was apparently to be our evolutionary destiny. Were it not for the fact that sometime in the last 5 million years or so, the African continent, which was the site of our environmental proto-system, began to dry up. And the forests that had always been our arboreal home began to shrink. And what this spelled for our remote proto-hominid ancestors was nutritional pressure. There wasn't enough food. Our remote ancestors began descending from the canopy and exploring the new environment that the aridity was bringing into existence, a grassland environment, an environment of limited numbers of plant and animal species relative to the climax tropical rainforests that were in retreat. Now, the reason animals specialize their food supply is to avoid contact with mutagens in the environment. If you begin experimenting with foods and begin eating everything, you will produce more children with mutations. Some of these mutations will be positive, most will be lethal. When our remote ancestors came under nutritional pressure, they began expanding their diet. This was the moment when we became partially carnivorous, when we became omnivores. And had I more time, I would lay out many examples of specific plants, such as plants that contain birth control alkaloids and things like that, specific plants that would have impacted early human emergence. But I want to concentrate here on one plant, and that is the psilocybin-containing mushrooms that grow in the dung of cattle. Because I think that if we're looking for a missing link, it isn't a transitional skeleton, it isn't meddling by extraterrestrials, at least not of the overt 1,000-ton beryllium ship variety. It has to do with the fact that we began to allow into our diet an exotic pseudo-neurotransmitter that was part of the native flora of the grassland. And I believe that, in the next 10 minutes, I can at least make it seem plausible to you that this mushroom was the triggering factor that moved us from being an advanced hominid, an advanced animal, to being, in fact, a conscious, self-reflecting, caring, thinking, dreaming, striving human being. And here is my answer to this riddle: where did human consciousness come from? It begins like this. In that foraging phase where we were testing all kinds of plants on the grassland, small amounts of psilocybin mushrooms would have naturally been eaten in the process of eating corms and things like that. I personally have seen baboons in Kenya investigating cow paddies on the savannah because they know that bug pupa will be under the cow paddies. So the cow paddies are already set up as vectors for possible sources of nutrition. So there is no question that these proto-hominids would have eaten psilocybin in small amounts. And by small amounts, I mean amounts so small that if you were to eat that much, you would feel nothing. But dose level has been studied, and it causes increased acuity of vision. You can actually give people small amounts of psilocybin and then give them eye tests, and they do better if they're slightly intoxicated than if they are not. The guy who proved this, the Viennese psychologist Roland Fischer, when he described these experiments to me, he said, "And so you see, my young friend, here we have a case where the use of drugs actually introduces us to a more true vision of reality than if we have avoided the drug." Scientific proof that the drug is telling you more about reality than if you had refused it. All right. Now, what kind of visual acuity is it that is being improved? Well, it turns out it's what's called edge detection. In the grassland environment, where the movement of small animals means dinner, and the movement of large animals means you become dinner, a plant which confers increased visual acuity is going to immediately confer an adaptive advantage on those members of the group that let it in. Those members of the group that refuse it out of aesthetic or gastronomic reasons will tend to be outbred, because the psilocybin-using members of the species will be more successful at obtaining food and at surviving to raise their own children to reproductive age, which is the name of the game in evolution. So that's step one of a three-step process that leads to the explosion of consciousness in the hominid brain. Step two, which should have special appeal for this crowd, is that when you take slightly larger doses of psilocybin, not religiously profound doses, but doses which you definitely feel, psilocybin is what's called a CNS stimulant, a central nervous system stimulant. What it causes in animals is what neurophysiologists call arousal. And in highly sexed animals like primates, arousal means, in the male, erection. So an animal then which is allowing what is essentially a sexual stimulant or an aphrodisiac to enter into the diet, there will be more instances of what anthropologists call successful copulations. And God knows we need that. So if you have more successful copulations, you have more pregnancies. You have a second factor, outbreeding the non-psilocybin using member of the population. Now, something really important here that is this whole thing is my theory, but here's the part of it that I like the best. All primates have what are called dominance hierarchies, or male dominance hierarchies. This goes right back clear to lemurs and the old world monkeys, which are much more, the new world monkeys, which are more primitive. All primates have this dominance hierarchy, and what it means is the sharp-fanged, hard-bodied young males, they control the women, the children, the elderly, all sexual minorities. Everybody is under the thumb of the alpha males. And as we sit here today, though this community may strive to be an exception, as a society, male dominance is an enormous dilemma for us and an enormous distorting factor in our politics and in our lives. So my notion is that psilocybin, by promoting this polymorphic sexual style, actually acted as an inoculation against monogamous sexual styles of bonding, you see. And it isn't that the monogamous style, the dominator style, disappeared. It was simply medicated out of existence for perhaps 100,000 years. It was medicated out of existence. Now, and what it promoted, this arousal, this psilocybin taking around the African campfires by these primitive nomadic pastoralists, what the social change that came with it was an orgiastic sexual style. A style where everybody would get loaded around the campfire and then hump in an enormous writhing heap. Now, yes, now, now, besides the fact that this is a great deal of fun, it has a very, very profound social effect, which is, in societies which allow orgy, men cannot trace lines of male paternity. Men cannot trace lines of male paternity. What does this mean? It means that men do not identify with children as property. It means that the men of that kind of a social group can only think in terms of our children. We, the group, our children. And it creates an immensely cohesive social glue that I believe held these societies together for millennia. And I believe that during this period of pharmacological suppression of male dominance, we became human beings. Theater, poetry, magic, art, altruism, dance, symbolic and cognitive activity of every sort was born in that window of opportunity when there was simultaneously a chemical suppression of male dominance and consequently an opening to Gaian intentionality, to the intent of the larger biological systems in which the human system was embedded. And a kind of paradise came into existence. There were actually two phases. One from about 40 to 30,000 years ago in the interglacial. And in that early phase, human beings, cattle, and mushrooms were sort of all swirling together there on the African grassland in contact, but not yet a coherent triad. The second partnership paradise arose at the last glaciation, at the melt, during the last glacial melt, and lasted from about 20,000 years ago to perhaps as much as recently as 10,000 years ago. And it was in that later phase that the Magdalenian explosion occurred and the social forms were put in place that Hellenistic paganism was looking back at with a nostalgic and barely cognizable memory. There was an old memory of a kind of paganism that was old 5,000 years before Eleusis laid its cornerstone. I wrote a book called The Archaic Revival, in which I tried to say that the entire cultural impulse of the 20th century, beginning with Freud and Jung discovering the unconscious, beginning with Picasso dragging back primitive West African masks to Paris and inserting them into his paintings, Dada, pataphysics, jazz, abstract expressionism, even phenomena like National Socialism. All of these various impulses in the 20th century, some positive, some negative, all have a common theme: archaism. Archaism, a nostalgia for a state before history. And as this tendency, this nostalgia has been sorted out over the last 100 years by generations of scholars, beginning with, Freud and Jung and Blavatsky and Crowley, and then coming up through all the folklorists and deconstructionists. As this thing has been teased apart, it has become clearer and clearer that the paradigmatic figure in any archetypal revival is the maker of magic, the shaman, the wizard, the seeress, the person who is in control with invisible forces. And as I have lived my life and explored these things for a long time, I've come to the conclusion that the shaman, without the hallucinogenic plants, is well on the way to becoming priest or priestess, well on the way to being downloaded into a fixed canon, a moral vision, a societal religious structure, which is not what shamanism is about. It's about Discordian ecstasy. It's about the felt presence of immediate experience in the absence of theory. That's what it's about. So, and then I want to go back to our little process. We've now covered step 1. Better vision through mushroom taking leads to better diets and healthier children. Bigger doses lead to an end to monogamy, a dissolution of pair bonding, and a replacement of monogamous anxiety with polymorphic amorousness, or whatever you want to call it. Then, that's only the second step. The third step is when you double the polyamorous dose. And now, hunting is out of the question, and even fucking is out of the question, because you are nailed to the ground somewhere off at the edge of the firelight, wrestling with a mystery so profound, so bizarre, that even as we sit here with Husserl and Heidegger and Heisenberg and all these clowns under our belts, it is still absolutely mysterious, appalling, challenging, boundary dissolving, and unavoidably ecstatic. It is the living mystery. And I don't know how many of them there are in the world, but for my money, there only has to be one to rescue the entire concept from, the dirty claws of the reductionists, the materialists, the Christers, the nothing butters, the merely this and the simply thaters. Yeah, I know I'm preaching to the converted, but if I preached to the unconverted, I'd be hung from the yardarm.